Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. We're actually at an interesting point in this series. We're kind of a climactic point in a way. We're sort of about to discover what's at the heart of Plato's solution to this fundamental and universal human problem that I've been talking about pretty much since the beginning of this video series. The problem of human self-dividedness, this sense that the psyche is in a way torn by loyalties to its rational and irrational parts. The struggle, you might say, between reason and passion, and the root cause, in my view, of existential despair. We're about to basically unlock the great hopeful power of the Platonic teaching on love and desire. And it might not come as a surprise that we begin this process of psychic healing and growth by, in a way, pulling off the bandage that covers the fundamental wound of the human personality or psyche or soul. To find a solution requires first getting to the heart of the problem, and that's what we'll be doing today. Before I get to that, there's something I thought I should mention first. Though I've taken this series now through 59 episodes, this is number 60, and the end is, I think, still probably at least a dozen episodes away. At the same time, the basic principles, I think, of Platonic love, of love in the real Platonic tradition, aren't that many really, and I probably would have been able to explain them all in a single episode, except that there was so much else I wanted to say, both to introduce the problem and give in the way of additional commentary and explanation, because some of these principles are in a way so foreign to our everyday thinking as to require a fair bit of that, a fair bit of explanation and commentary. And also I just wanted to take a bit of time to linger over some of these Platonic passages and ideas and controversies of interpretation that are interesting and I think beautiful in themselves. And yeah, I think a controversy can be beautiful, even perhaps must be if it's presented truthfully enough. I don't claim to have done that here, but I think it's at least possible. There can be a kind of wondrous harmony to discord. Discord, if presented in this kind of divine light, presented truthfully, has its own sort of harmony. And this, I think, is a big theme in Homer, especially the Iliad, in the history of Thucydides, history of the Peloponnesian War, in the philosophy of Hegel, and perhaps we even see it at times, or glimmers of it, in the best kind of journalism and history. And perhaps that could be our great wish for peace and freedom, that we present our discord to ourselves truthfully enough to be harmonious. Anyway, despite the considerable length of this series, I think it's actually fair to say that love in the Platonic tradition can, really be summed up in a few basic ideas. The first is this claim of Diotima's that I keep coming back to, this idea that all human desire is for the good. The idea that the good is the one could be taken perhaps as a second principle. And finally, in this and the next couple of episodes, we come to the third and final principle, which really kind of changes everything. It, as I said, unlocks everything. And it's in the form of this wondrous and beautiful myth of the soul in his Phaedrus, which we started looking at last time, that Plato gives us this. We talked last time about how in Plato and the long Platonic tradition, there's this story of the fall of the soul, in which it both loses its wings and comes to be in a body. And we talked about how we could see in this myth the idea of the psyche developing this power or habit of objectification. And we saw of standing apart from objects, of seeing objects as things that stand apart from it. And we saw how there is a tendency in both Plato and his followers to attribute it at least partly to vice, a kind of audacity or excessive pride. But there's another element in this fall, one very different from the first, I think, because while the first element invites us to kind of self-blame, this one invites us to a deep sorrow, to that recognition of deep loss that is actually a necessary step, I think, to healing and growth. So this other element is forgetfulness. And Plato depicts this actually as something that befalls the psyche in a more tragic way, as something not entirely of its own causing. Souls in heaven, Socrates tells Phaedrus, struggle and vie with one another to attain this feast of goodness and truth that the gods enjoy. But after that, he writes, some of them begin their great fall. If a soul, he says, quote, does not see anything true because it could not keep up, and by some accident takes on a burden of forgetfulness and wrongdoing, then it is weighed down, sheds its wings, and falls to earth. By some accident, it takes on a burden of forgetfulness. This is how souls come to have bodies, and how the bodies of human beings and other animals come to be ensouled. Souls take on different earthly lives according to how much they have seen of the pure light beyond heaven that we talked about last time. And when their earthly lives come to an end, they're judged depending on whether they have lived justly or not. They're only allowed, Socrates says, to regain their wings and return to the celestial realm after 10,000 years, except for those who have seen the most of the pure light and live their earthly lives as philosophers, and those who love youths well, the latter being something that Socrates will expound in more detail later in this dialogue. So a kind of tragedy in this mythical account has befallen us all, that we find ourselves in this habit of objectification of the other, of taking in our minds some part of reality without the whole, in a way manipulating it mentally, internally, in order to manipulate it concretely in the outer world. Somehow accompanying this habit is a forgetting of the whole, or the one, or the good. We actually forget that it is the true object of our desire. And so we whose primal or original state in some way is to be at one with reality, separate ourselves from it without even being aware of that separation, or therefore of any need to reunite ourselves with reality. And I think one passage in the Platonic tradition that conveys this sense of tragedy especially powerfully is from Plotinus's Enneads. True to that tradition, Plotinus shows no great concern with using religious language in philosophy. And in this passage, he speaks of the higher world of truth, goodness, and unity as a fatherly God from whom we have tragically become separated at such an early age that we have even forgotten his very existence. And in not knowing our parentage, he says, we become ignorant also of ourselves. And he writes, what can it be, therefore, that has made the souls forget the God who is their Father and be ignorant of themselves and him, even though they are parts of that world? Literally, eke then, they come thence, they come from there, and completely belong to it. And this is where he makes this claim I mentioned last week, that the cause of their fall was audacity, willing to belong to themselves, a kind of declaration of independence from the one. But when this claim is read in the context of this passage, we see that we are to feel not just a kind of self-blame, but also perhaps a great compassion for ourselves, for this great suffering of separation we have undergone without even having realized it. He continues, since they appeared actually to take pleasure in their autonomy and to have made much use of their self-motion, running in the opposite direction and getting as far away from home as possible, they came not to know even that they themselves were from there, eke then, from that pure radiance, he means. They were like children who at birth are separated from their fathers, and being raised for a long time far away, are ignorant both of themselves and of their fathers. Our forgetfulness of our origin, of our true nature, Plotinus continues, results in what you could call low self-esteem, but low self-esteem on the most basic, or if you like, existential level, a misplaced zeal for the products of our objectification, these finite goals that we create for ourselves, rather than that pure radiance which our own souls, or personalities, if you like, somehow speak of, and in some way possess on the most basic but yet sort of concealed level. He writes of human souls, quote, they can then no longer see their father or themselves, and they dishonor themselves due to their ignorance of their lineage, honoring instead other things, in fact, everything more than themselves. They marvel at these things and are awestruck by them. They love them and are dependent on them. They severed themselves as much as possible from the things from which they turned away and which they dishonored. So it follows that it is honoring these things and dishonoring themselves that is the cause of their absolute ignorance of God. For to pursue and marvel at something is at the same time to accept that one is inferior to that which one is pursuing and to that at which one is marveling. If one supposes oneself inferior to things that come to be and perish, and assumes oneself to be the most dishonored and mortal of the things one does honor, neither the nature nor the power of God could ever be, quote, and he alludes to a Homeric passage here, could ever be, quote, impressed in one's heart, unquote. So a great catastrophe of forgetfulness has somehow befallen us all. We are all, in a way, lost souls, sapient beings with yet no real self-knowledge, enslaved in a way to impulses and prone to various forms of self-dividedness and suffering that we don't understand. And this reminds me of that image that Plato comes up with at the end of near the end of the Republic. He talks about the sea god Glaucus. So he's unrecognizable from being in the sea for so long, and parts of him having been broken off and becoming encrusted with sea creatures. And I also come back here to a couple other things. A thought I've cited before in this series, this observation by Harvard philosophy professor Christine Korsgaard that, quote, human beings seem psychologically damaged in ways that suggest some deep break with nature. And I'm also reminded, especially by this passage of Plotinus, of that African-American spiritual that wondrously kind of echoes Plotinus and says so much in so few words. It conveys, in a few words, this existential alienation from both oneself and the cosmos, from both internal and external nature, that has been one of the main themes, of course, of this series. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. And so, as I've said, part of our journey of Platonic love, a very important part of it, lies in the recognition of a vast and almost unspeakable sense of loss. But as I keep mentioning, the other big part of it is deep hope and an also almost unspeakable joy. And it's actually precisely, in a way, buried in this image of forgetting, which Plato has so beautifully and thoughtfully laid before us, that this hope lies. And less seriously, I'm reminded, being as I am 56 years of age as I record this, of the intro to the 1970s show, The $6 Million Man, in which we hear Oscar Goldman say of the severely injured Steve Austin, "We can rebuild him. We have the technology. We can make him better than he was." Anyway, I say hope is buried in Plato's image of forgetting because our journey, as it often is a vertical one that involves digging. If we take Plato's myth literally, we're forced to believe in the soul or psyche or personality having a kind of quasi-bodily existence, traveling through space to enter and depart from bodies. I mean, as though it were something bodily, something that could just enter and then leave another body. So then, actually, by being asked to believe something at which our reason rebels, we would be led to an even greater self-dividedness. So this surely isn't what's being asked of us. We must then mine this wondrous and beautiful myth of reincarnation and forgetting for its meaning, the ore of sense that we can take away from it and that will give us not just a vague sense of hope, or the kind of flimsy hope one might get from inspirational messages. If I can allude to my rant of earlier this year, but real understanding and real direction. And that's what we'll be starting to do next week. I hope you can join me then, and until then, be well, and thanks for watching.